Good evening, sir. Yes, yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Right. 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 I'll give my best, sir. Thank you, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Sir. So let me start, sir. So my topic is, as you have already mentioned, it is extent of judicial governance and judicial activism in the context of India in United States of America. I have basically adopted a doctrinal research method and, to be precise, the expository study. So before I proceed, I would like to discuss regarding the structure of my paper. I have broadly divided my paper into 4 chapters. Chapter 1 carries the introduction part, wherein I have discussed the historical background and the genesis of the topic, along with the problem statement and the reason for the need of research on this topic. This is followed by chapter 2, wherein chapter 2, which I, sir, sir, yes, sir, okay, okay, got it, sir. Yes, sir, yes, sir, right, sir, got it, sir, got it, sir, got it. I appreciate, sir. Sir, actually, I wanted to give you a glimpse of, because you had taught the research methodology. So I thought maybe if I give the proper chapterization and all, so you can appreciate that. Got it, sir. Got it. I got your point, sir. Right, right, sir. Fine, sir. I stand corrected, sir. Right, sir. Right. Thank you, sir. Right, right. So, sir, I won't be discussing the chapterization part, but in a brief now, I'll discuss with the chapter 2, which I have titled Theory. So, in part 1, I have discussed the literature review, and in part 2, I have formulated a hypothesis, and in part 3, I have discussed the research approach and methodology. And in chapter 3, which I have titled Discussion Part, so in part 1, I have discussed the concept of living constitution and originalism. In part 2, I have analyzed the legitimacy of the judicial governance, and in part 3, I have discussed the extent of judicial governance in India. This is followed by part 4, wherein I have discussed the extent of judicial governance in USA, and in part 5, I have done a comparison of judicial review in India and USA. And in finally, part 6 of this chapter, I have categorized judicial governance with the help of Indian cases, something which Sir has discussed in one of his lectures. And sir, chapter 4 is about the findings, wherein I have concluded the results of the study. And finally, chapter 5, which is my concluding part, in part 1, I have laid down some suggestions which I have titled as Need of the Hour. and in part 2 I have given my concluding remarks. So sir, I now begin with the introduction. So a search as to the origin of the phrase judicial activism and what it precisely connotes is nothing short of venturing into a labyrinth. Various jurists, they have, like Blackstone, Bentham, Austin, they have held opinions on the subject. And in fact, in the first half of the 20th century, a flood of scholarship discussed the merits of judicial legislation, and the famous jurists and scholars took positions on either side of the debate. So criticism of the judicial legislation, however, was particularly vehement during the Lochner era. Many modern scholars consider Lochner virtually synonymous with the phrase judicial activism. However, the contemporaneous literature does not mention judicial activism by the name. The origin of the term judicial activism can be attributed to Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr., who in January 1947 issue of Fortune magazine wrote an article titled The Supreme Court 1947. Schlesinger profiled the court of judges of 9 judges into justices who wanted to use their judicial power to implement their vision of the social good, that is the judicial activists, those who wanted to leave such decisions to the legislatures, that is the champions of the self-restraint, and finally those who compromised what he attributed as the middle group. So judicial governance may be defined as somewhat a laudatory simile of judicial activism. And Ronald Dworkin, a great academic jurist, he has a theory about the legitimacy of judicial governance. Present day judges, he says, who may have had nothing to do with the written constitution when it was framed by reason of their position as judges, become and must act like partners with the framers of the constitution in order to interpret a historical document in the best possible light. So I would now like to discuss about the need for the research. Sir, aim of my research is to explain the role of judicial activism, albeit cautions, which it can play in the modern day context, so that there is no overreach either from the executive or from the judiciary. The idea is to expose people to all the facets of the problem and thus to invoke a new thought, at least, if not to bring about a radical change in the minds of people who have stuck to one point of view either due to lack of facts or even otherwise. I now move on to the chapter 3, wherein I have discussed the concept of living constitution and originalism. Sir, W.J. Walshaw, he sought to resolve the impasse over the judicial review of written constitution. The author has described two groups, one group which upheld and the other group which criticized the Canadian Charter of Rights. He called them the boosters and the bashers. For the boosters, the rigidity of the constitution was what made it valuable, and for the bashers, this was one of the chief ills of the constitution. Yet, according to the author, neither approach is true of the constitutions. A written constitution, he says, should be viewed as a living tree with roots in precedent and in community's constitutional morality, a tree that has branches and grows over time through evolving common law and jurisprudence. And the author makes a convincing case of how this enables an approach to constitutionalism that is both authoritative and flexible. And sir, no wonder we can visualize the Constitution of India as a similar fashion. A large number of directed principles of state policy, DPSP, which have not been declared by the Constitution to be enforceable in any court, but which are nonetheless fundamental to the governance of the country, have now been made enforceable by the courts through the long, wide and liberal interpretation of Article 21 of the Constitution of India. Sir, for paucity of time, I would like to skip the legitimacy of the judicial governance part, and I would like to move over to the meat of my research, sir. And before I move on to that part, sir, I'll just mention the articles like Article 142, Article 104, Article 32, Article 226, Article 227 and Article 21. These are some of the articles which establish the legitimacy of judicial governance. So sir, now coming to the next topic, extent of judicial governance in India. Sir, in India, the content and reach of the judicial power is not defined neither in our constitution nor anywhere else. In fact, in a Westminster type constitution, it is never so defined. Recalling the Lianage's case, which went up to the Privy Council from the Ceylon, which is present day Sri Lanka, which had a Westminster constitution like India's. In this case, an ordinance passed by the state to try three prominent ministers who had taken part in a failed coup d'etat against the state, not by the established courts of the land, but by a special tribunal of three judges, was challenged by the council of the government on the ground that it asserts the judicial power. The plea taken by the government council was that unlike the USA constitution, this Westminster type constitution does not mention anywhere nor even recognize the concept of judicial power. But the Privy Council rejected the plea. The acts were accordingly, sir, held ultra vires and void, and the convictions could not stand. Although many would believe that the written constitution, which gave power to the courts to strike down a legislation made by the parliament, is undemocratic, as it enables the unelected judges to thwart the wishes of the general public. But this argument is not completely baseless and would depend on the case-to-case basis, and also might be theoretically correct in a way. But consider a case where these elected representatives, they fail to perform in a way which is unconstitutional, or they fail to perform their duties. Further, there is a chapter in the Indian Constitution on fundamental rights, which declares that all laws and all executive actions which are inconsistent with them are expressly declared to be void. Thus, in such a controversy, there has to be some final deciding authority, and under our constitution, it is the country's apex court, that is the Supreme Court of India. Sir. Sir. Yes, sir. Sir, it is permissible, and I'll give the example of one case which happened in the case of RNRL versus RIL, sir. It was the dispute between the two brothers. So, sir, it was a case about the two warring brothers. But what happened in this particular case? The case was about the usage of scarce natural resources. So, sir, in this particular case, the government, it became an interpreter in the final Supreme Court case. Government was not the interpreter in the initial cases, sir. Division bench and all. But government became an interpreter in the Supreme Court. So, sir, in that particular case, the Supreme Court, created a jurisprudence. Created a new issue as to who is the owner of the scarce natural resources in India, and it invoked various articles of the Constitution of India to establish that, sir. Uh, right. Yes. Yes. Sir, sir, it is called a judicial overactivism, and actually you only gave an example of Vishakha case, sir, in class, and actually, sir, I have included. But sir, yes, 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 sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, sir. Actually, just to, sir, please, sir. Sir, actually, just wanted to come to that particular topic. Actually, I have kept a small chapter here, a small topic, which I have categorized as judicial governance, and with the help of Indian cases, sir. I solely attribute this part to you, sir, and would also like to mention that this is something unique, and I did not found in such a categorization anywhere, sir, while searching. And in fact, this is one of the parts in my paper which makes my research unique on this popular topic, sir. Since this was discussed in the class amidst a lot of class participation, and you had asked each student, sir, so I was actually about to skip this part, but since you have already mentioned, so I'll just give the five, sir, major heads of the category which you have given in the class, sir. So, sir, first of the category which you gave, sir, it was discharging a constitutional duty by way of judicial governance. Second, you talked about, sir, judicial activism. Sir, third is judicial overreach. Third is, sir, fourth is, I have actually dared to add it in spite of an exhaustive categorization given by you, sir. So I have somewhat given it as a subcategory, but I have anyhow made it a separate category. So the fourth category is, sir, judicial slippage or contraction up to a vanishing point. I have given, I have mentioned it. Sir, slippery role, I have mentioned slippery role as fifth part. Apart from that, sir, I have made a subcategory that up to a vanishing point, sir, contraction to a vanishing point. So, sir, actually, I owe this to you. I owe this particular part to you. I have listened and taken the notes in the class. Yes, sir. Right, sir. Sir, if you permit me, I can read my concluding part. Sure, sir, sure, sir. So, sir, I'll just finally come to the conclusion. So, living originalism is the need of the hour when interpretation and construction both have to come to the rescue. And text, as well as intent of values and principles, is of utmost relevance and importance. With an unprecedented and unplanned series of lockdowns, this government has not fulfilled the aspirations of many people as an executive. The court dismissed the concerns brought before it with phrases like, how can we stop the migrants from walking? It was not possible for the court to monitor who is walking and who is not walking. And the states are providing interstate. Just a moment, sir, my video stopped. Yeah, and the states are providing interstate transport. This approach, adopted by the apex court, it paints a very disheartening image of the status quo of our democracy. The courts are abdicated itself of the responsibility of guarding the fundamental rights by merely throwing the ball in the court of the government. A new facet of the not us judgment has been conceived, which is not restricted to this single incident alone. It is an accepted principle that the legislature and the executive are much better versed with the needs of the people at the ground level, and the judiciary shall not interfere with the functions of the other two organs. But aforementioned situation conceives a must answer question. What if the other two organs fail to perform their constitutional obligations? This is the sole reason why the founding fathers were repelled by the idea of absolute separation of powers, and this is the reason why Article 142 was proudly and neatly placed in the holy document, which was also called, sir, the flaming sword, which was contemplated by Justice Bose, Vivian Bose. And sir, finally, the sir. Yes, sir. No, yes, sir. Not any new case. Yes, sir. But you are absolutely correct, sir. Sir, basically, what I'm trying to say here is that various petitions were filed before the court. Court could have invoked Article 142, and to do complete justice, it could have used that article. But it was a complete apathy of the court. It did not invoke that particular article. That is my point, sir. And sir, lastly, I'd like to conclude that the tools of judicial trade, that is judicial review, etc., they are crucial to the judicial independence and have been developed over the generations. They should not be discarded lightly, as it might be horrific to be living under rule by law, which is made by parliamentarians without any possibility of it being questioned by the judicial arm of the state, rather than to live under rule of law, which is guarded by the judiciary. If judges are to get off the back of parliamentarians, politicians, and bureaucrats who claim the exclusive and direct right to govern on a basis of universal adult franchise and statistical majority, then they must come up with a much better track record of performance. In our constitutional history, judicial power has kept vacillating from contracting at times to expanding at times, as per the exigencies of the moment. Lord Anthony Lester, England's leading lawyer, once gave a modern day version of Lord Acton's famous phrase, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. He said that some judges have a variant to this, and they say that judicial power is wonderful and absolute judicial power is absolutely wonderful. Although he said it frivolously, but this might be true of some, sir. Thus, ample judicial power coupled with ample judicial wisdom is the need of the hour, not a curtailment of judicial power, but rather a mature wisdom in its administration. No, we don't need judges who behave like emperors, as legitimate judicial power loses legitimacy when it is not exercised in an appropriate manner and in appropriate cases, as was also held by Honorable Supreme Court in Srimati Ujjam Bai versus State of UP case. What we do is are the ones as per the famous poem titled God Give Us Men by Josiah Gilbert Holland. And I'll just read a few lines of that wonderful poem, sir. God give us men, a time like this demands, strong minds, great hearts, true faith, and ready hands. Men whom the lust of the office does not kill, men whom the spoils of the office cannot buy, men who possess opinions and a will, men who have honor, men who will not lie, and men who can stand before a demagogue. Sir, the poem is pretty long, so I'll just end it here. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, sir.